The train whistle echoed across the Montana plains as Li Mei stepped onto the wooden platform at Copper Creek Station. Her small hands clutched a worn leather satchel containing everything she owned in the world. The September wind whipped her black hair across her face as she searched the crowd for the man she had traveled 8,000 miles to marry. 24 years old and barely 5 feet tall, Li Mei had never imagined she would leave her village in Guangdong province to become a bride in the American West. But drought had devastated her family's farm, and her father's debts to the local warlord left them with impossible choices. When the marriage broker showed her the letter from James Mitchell, a cattle rancher seeking a wife, she made the hardest decision of her life. The letter was simple and honest. James wrote that he owned 2,000 acres of good grazing land, raised beef cattle, and lived alone in a house he had built with his own hands. He was 32 years old, stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, and had never been married. He promised to treat his wife with respect and provide for her needs. Most importantly, he had sent money for her passage and asked for nothing in return except companionship and a chance to build a life together. Li Mei spotted him immediately. Even in a crowd, James Mitchell stood like a giant among men. His broad shoulders strained against a clean white shirt, and his brown hair caught the afternoon sunlight. When their eyes met, he removed his hat and walked toward her with measured steps. "Miss Li?" His voice was deep but gentle. "I'm James Mitchell." She bowed slightly, as was proper in her culture. "I am honored to meet you, Mr. Mitchell." James noticed her bow and awkwardly attempted one in return, nearly dropping his hat. The gesture was clumsy but sincere, and Li Mei felt a flutter of hope. Perhaps this man would be kind. "Did you have a good journey?" he asked, taking her satchel. "Very long, but I am grateful to be here safely." Li Mei's English was careful but clear. She had studied the language for months before leaving China, knowing her survival in this new land would depend on it. As they walked toward his wagon, Li Mei became aware of the stares and whispers following them. A group of women outside the general store stopped their conversation to watch her pass. Their faces showed a mixture of curiosity and disapproval that made Li Mei's stomach tighten. "Is that her?" one woman whispered loudly enough for Li Mei to hear. "The Chinese woman he sent for?" "Poor man must be desperate," another replied. "Couldn't find a decent Christian woman to marry him, so he had to order one from the Orient like a piece of goods from a catalog." James's jaw tightened, but he kept walking. Li Mei pretended not to hear, though each word felt like a small knife cutting into her confidence. The wagon ride to James's ranch took an hour through rolling hills dotted with cattle. Li Mei marveled at the vast open spaces, so different from the crowded villages of her homeland. James pointed out landmarks and told her about the land, his voice warming as he spoke of his cattle and the home he had built. "I started with 50 head of cattle 5 years ago," he explained. "Now I run about 800 on the range. It's good land here with plenty of water from the creek that runs through the property." "You built all of this yourself?" Li Mei asked, genuinely impressed. "Most of it. Had some help with the barn raising, but the house I did alone. It's not fancy, but it's solid and warm." The house that came into view was indeed solid, a 2-story structure of rough-hewn logs with a stone chimney and a wide front porch. It sat in a grove of cottonwood trees, with the barn and corrals spread out behind it. Li Mei had never seen anything like it. "It's beautiful," she said, and meant it. James helped her down from the wagon, and Li Mei noticed how carefully he handled her, as if she might break. She appreciated his gentleness, though she was tougher than her small size suggested. Inside, the house was simply furnished but clean. The main room had a stone fireplace, a wooden table and chairs, and shelves lined with books. Li Mei was surprised by the books, more than she had ever seen in one place. "Do you read much?" James asked, noticing her interest. "I can read Chinese characters and I am learning English letters. My father taught me when I was young." "Your father taught you to read?" James sounded impressed. "That's unusual, isn't it?" Li Mei nodded. "My father believed education was important for everyone, even daughters. Many people in our village thought he was foolish, but he said knowledge would serve me better than dowry goods." James showed her to a small room upstairs that would be hers until their wedding. He had prepared it with a narrow bed, a washstand, and hooks on the wall for her clothes. Everything was clean and thoughtfully arranged. "I know this is all strange for you," James said quietly. "We can take as much time as you need to get acquainted before we marry. I don't want you to feel rushed or pressured." His consideration touched Li Mei deeply. In her village, marriages were often arranged quickly with little concern for the bride's comfort. "Thank you for your kindness," she said. "I would like to learn about your customs and your land, and perhaps you could learn about mine." Over the following days, Li Mei settled into a routine on the ranch. She rose early to prepare breakfast, then spent her mornings helping James with various tasks around the property. Despite her small stature, she proved surprisingly capable. She learned to milk the cow, gather eggs from the chickens, and tend the vegetable garden behind the house. James was amazed by her work ethic and her willingness to learn. She asked intelligent questions about everything from cattle breeding to crop rotation. When he showed her how to mend fence wire, she watched carefully and soon was making repairs herself. "You don't have to work so hard," he told her one morning as she helped him move hay bales. "I want to contribute," Li Mei replied. "In my country, we say that a good wife makes her husband's burdens lighter, not heavier." But not everyone appreciated Li Mei's presence in Copper Creek. When James took her to town for supplies the following week, the reception was noticeably cool. The shopkeeper served them, but avoided making eye contact with Li Mei. Other customers whispered and stared. At the church social on Saturday evening, the situation became even more uncomfortable. James had hoped to introduce Li Mei to the community in a friendly setting, but the evening quickly turned sour. "I can't believe you brought her here," Martha Henderson, the banker's wife, said loudly enough for half the room to hear. "This is a Christian gathering." "Li Mei is my intended wife," James replied firmly. "She has every right to be here." "Your intended wife?" scoffed Tom Bradley, who owned the livery stable. "You can't seriously be planning to marry that heathen." Li Mei felt her face burning with shame, but she kept her head high. She had faced prejudice before, though never so openly hostile. "She's probably a spy," suggested another woman. "You hear stories about the Chinese sending people to learn our ways and report back to their emperor. Or she's here to steal our men and corrupt our children with her foreign ways," added Martha Henderson. James stepped forward, his considerable height making the other men look small by comparison. "That's enough. Li Mei is a good, honest woman who has done nothing to deserve your suspicion or your rudeness." "She's different from us, James," said Pastor Williams, trying to sound reasonable. "Her people have strange customs and worship false gods. How can you build a Christian home with such a woman?" Li Mei had remained silent during the attacks, but this last comment stirred something inside her. She stepped forward, her voice clear and steady. "I understand your concerns about my faith," she said. "In my country, I learned about the teachings of Confucius, which speak of respect, kindness, and caring for others. Since coming here, I have been reading Mr. Mitchell's Bible and learning about Jesus, who taught many of the same things. Perhaps we are not so different." Her words surprised the crowd. Several people exchanged glances, not expecting such a thoughtful response. "Reading the Bible doesn't make you a Christian," Martha Henderson snapped. "You need to be baptized and accept Jesus as your Savior." "I am willing to learn more about this," Li Mei replied calmly. "But I think being Christian means more than just saying words. It means treating others with kindness, even when they are different from you." The room fell silent. Lee May's quiet dignity in the face of their hostility made several people uncomfortable. They had expected her to cower or become angry, not to respond with such grace. James looked at her with new respect. This small woman from across the world had just handled herself better than he could have managed. "I think we should go," he said quietly. As they walked to their wagon, Lee May could hear the conversations resuming behind them. She knew they would be the subject of much discussion for weeks to come. "I'm sorry about that," James said as they drove home under the stars. "It's not your fault," Lee May replied. "People fear what they don't understand. In my village, we were also suspicious of outsiders at first. You handled yourself well in there, better than I did." Lee May smiled in the darkness. "My father always said that anger is easy, but wisdom requires patience." When they reached the ranch, James helped her down from the wagon, and they stood for a moment looking up at the vast Montana sky. The stars seemed brighter here than anywhere Lee May had ever been. "Do you regret coming here?" James asked quietly. Lee May considered the question carefully. The journey had been difficult, and the reception in town had been hurtful. But she looked at this kind man who had shown her nothing but respect, at the beautiful land that could become her home, and at the possibilities that lay ahead. "No," she said finally. "I don't regret it. But I think we both have much to learn about each other and about this place we want to call home." James nodded, feeling a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the mild evening air. This remarkable woman was nothing like what he had expected when he first wrote that letter. She was stronger, wiser, and braver than he had dared hope. As they walked toward the house, neither of them noticed the rider watching from the ridge above the ranch. Bart Hutchinson had been one of the men at the church social, and he was not pleased with how the evening had ended. In his mind, James Mitchell was making a terrible mistake that would affect the whole community. The next morning brought new challenges. James found several of his cattle scattered far from where they should have been, their fence cut in 3 places. It could have been an accident or natural wear, but the clean cuts suggested otherwise. "Someone's been here," he told Lee May as they surveyed the damage. "This wasn't done by weather or animals." Lee May examined the cut wire carefully. "In my village, we had problems with people who wanted to cause trouble for families they didn't like. They would damage crops or break tools." "You think someone did this because of you?" James asked, though he had already reached the same conclusion. "It's possible. Some people in town made it clear they don't approve of me being here." James felt anger rising in his chest, but Lee May's calm acceptance kept him from exploding. She had accepted this possibility with the same quiet strength she had shown at the church social. They spent the morning repairing the fence and rounding up the scattered cattle. Lee May proved to be surprisingly good at handling the animals, moving quietly among them without causing panic. James watched her work and realized he was falling in love with this remarkable woman. That afternoon, as they returned to the house for lunch, they saw a rider approaching. It was Pastor Williams, looking uncomfortable but determined. "James, Miss Lee," he called as he dismounted. "I wonder if I might speak with you both for a few minutes." They invited him in, and Lee May prepared tea while the men sat at the kitchen table. Pastor Williams cleared his throat several times before speaking. "I wanted to apologize for last night," he began. "Some of the things said were unkind and unworthy of Christian people." "Thank you," James replied. "That means a lot. I also wanted to speak with Miss Lee about her interest in our faith." He turned to her as she served the tea. "If you're serious about learning about Christianity, I'd be willing to provide instruction." Lee May bowed her head respectfully. "I would be honored to learn from you, Pastor Williams." "It won't be easy," he warned. There are certain beliefs you would need to accept, and you would need to be baptized before you could be married in our church." "I understand. I'm willing to study and learn." Pastor Williams nodded slowly. "Very well. We can begin this week if you'd like." After he left, James turned to Lee May with concern. "You don't have to do this for me. I don't require you to change your beliefs to become my wife." Lee May smiled at his consideration. "I'm not changing my beliefs, James. I'm adding to them. The more I learn about this Jesus, the more I see that he taught love and acceptance. These are things I already believe in." That evening, as they sat on the front porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold, Lee May felt a sense of peace settling over her. The challenges ahead would be significant, but she was no longer facing them alone. "James," she said quietly, "I want you to know that whatever happens with the people in town, I'm glad I came here. You're a good man, and this is a beautiful place to build a life." James reached over and gently took her hand. "I'm glad you came too, Lee May, more than you know." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, neither of them could imagine the trials that lay ahead or the way their quiet love would eventually transform not just their own lives, but the entire community of Copper Creek. The first snow came early that October, blanketing the Montana landscape in pristine white. Lee May stood at the kitchen window, marveling at how the familiar ranch looked transformed overnight. In her homeland, snow was rare, and she had never seen anything so beautiful or so cold. "We'll need to move the cattle to the lower pastures today," James said, pulling on his heavy coat. "The weather's turning faster than usual this year." Lee May had been taking lessons with Pastor Williams for 3 weeks now, and their sessions had become the talk of the town. Some people were impressed by her sincere questions and thoughtful understanding of the Bible stories. Others remained convinced that her interest was merely an act designed to fool the community. "Can I help with the cattle?" she asked, wrapping herself in the warm wool cloak James had bought for her. "It'll be cold work, and we might be out there most of the day," James warned. "I'm stronger than I look," Lee May replied, with a smile that had become precious to him over the past weeks. They saddled their horses just as the sun broke through the clouds, turning the snow-covered fields into a glittering wonderland. Lee May had become an accomplished rider under James's patient instruction, and she handled her gentle mare with growing confidence. As they rode toward the upper pasture, they encountered Bill Crawford, James's nearest neighbor, struggling to repair a broken wagon wheel in the middle of the trail. His wife Sarah sat on the wagon seat, holding their 6-month-old baby and looking worried. "Morning, Bill," James called out, dismounting to examine the problem. "Looks like you're having some trouble." "Wheel cracked clean through," Bill replied, frustration evident in his voice. "We were heading to town for supplies before the storm gets worse, but now we're stuck." Lee May approached Sarah Crawford cautiously. She had met the woman briefly at the church social, and while Sarah hadn't been openly hostile, she had kept her distance. "Your baby is beautiful," Lee May said softly, admiring the infant bundled in warm blankets. Sarah looked surprised by the compliment. "Thank you. This is little Mary." The baby chose that moment to begin crying, and Sarah rocked her gently. "She's been fussy all morning. I think she might be getting sick." Lee May studied the child with careful eyes. "May I look at her? In my village, I helped care for many babies. I might be able to tell if something is wrong." Sarah hesitated, then reluctantly handed Mary to Lee May. The baby's crying intensified for a moment, then gradually subsided as Lee May held her with practiced ease. "She's very warm," Lee May observed, feeling the child's forehead. "And see how she pulls her legs up to her belly? I think she has what we call crying sickness in China. Her stomach hurts because she cannot pass gas properly." "Colic?" Sarah asked hopefully. "Yes, I think so. In my country, we have a remedy." Lee May gently massaged the baby's stomach in small circles, then carefully moved her legs in a bicycling motion. Within minutes, Mary released a small burp followed by obvious relief, and her crying stopped completely. "How did you know to do that?" Sarah asked in amazement. "My aunt was a midwife. She taught me many things about caring for babies and children. Would you like me to show you the massage technique?" For the next few minutes, Lee May demonstrated the gentle massage, explaining how to recognize the signs of colic and when to apply the treatment. Sarah listened intently, asking questions and practicing the movements under Lee May's guidance. Meanwhile, James and Bill had fashioned a temporary repair for the wagon wheel using rope and a piece of wood from the wagon bed. It wouldn't hold for long, but it would get them to town. "You folks should come to our place for dinner this Sunday," Sarah said suddenly, as Lee May helped her settle the now peaceful baby back in the wagon. "I'd like to learn more about caring for children, and Bill's been wanting to discuss cattle breeding with James." It was the first social invitation Lee May had received from anyone in the community, and she felt a warm glow of acceptance. "We would be honored," Lee May replied, bowing her head slightly in gratitude. As the Crawford wagon disappeared down the trail, James looked at Lee May with admiration. "You were wonderful with that baby. Where did you learn so much about caring for children?" "In my village. Everyone helped with everyone's children. I learned from my aunt, my grandmother, and many other women. It was considered important knowledge for all girls to have." They spent the rest of the day moving cattle, and Lee May proved to be invaluable help. She seemed to understand the animals instinctively, moving quietly among them and anticipating their behavior in ways that impressed James. When a young bull tried to break away from the herd, she positioned herself perfectly to turn him back without causing a stampede. "You're a natural at this," James told her as they drove the last group of cattle into the lower pasture. "Animals are the same everywhere," Lee May replied. "They want to feel safe and cared for, just like people." The next morning brought troubling news. Tom Bradley arrived at the ranch just after dawn, his face grim with worry. "James, we need your help," he said without preamble. "The Johnson family's little boy is sick, and Doc Peterson is stuck in Billings until the railroad gets the tracks clear from the storm." Lee May listened from the kitchen doorway, remembering how hostile Tom had been at the church social. "What's wrong with the boy?" James asked. "High fever? Trouble breathing?" "Mrs. Johnson is beside herself with worry. The other women in town have tried everything they know, but nothing's helping." James looked toward Lee May, remembering her skill with the Crawford baby. "Tom, Lee May knows quite a bit about caring for sick children. Would the Johnsons be willing to let her take a look?" Tom's face showed his internal struggle. His prejudice warred with his genuine concern for the sick child. "I don't know, James. The Johnsons might not be comfortable with, well, you know. Their son's life might depend on getting help," Lee May said quietly, stepping forward. "I understand their hesitation, but if there's a chance I could help, shouldn't we try?" Tom studied her face, seeing no trace of pride or offense at his obvious reluctance. Finally, he nodded slowly. "I'll ask them, but I can't promise they'll say yes." An hour later, they rode into town to find the Johnson home in crisis. 8-year-old Timothy Johnson lay in his bed, burning with fever and struggling to breathe. His mother, Eleanor, sat beside him with tears streaming down her face while several neighbor women hovered nearby, looking helpless. When Tom explained about Lee May's knowledge of children's illnesses, Eleanor Johnson looked up with desperate eyes. "I don't care if she's Chinese, Indian, or from the moon," Eleanor said firmly. "If she can help my son, I want her to try." Lee May approached the bedside carefully, aware that everyone in the room was watching her every move. She placed her hand gently on Timothy's forehead, then examined his throat and listened to his breathing. "Has he been coughing for long?" she asked Eleanor. 3 days. It started as a small cough, but it's gotten much worse. and the fever came on yesterday. Li Mei noticed the way Timothy's breathing sounded wet and labored. In her village, she had seen similar symptoms before. I think he has what we call chest dampness, she explained. His lungs are filled with fluid from fighting the sickness. We need to help his body clear the dampness and reduce the fever. How? Eleanor asked desperately. First, we make the air moist so he can breathe easier. Do you have a large pot? While Eleanor fetched a pot, Li Mei asked for specific herbs and ingredients. Most of the women looked puzzled, but Martha Henderson stepped forward. I have eucalyptus leaves in my herb garden, she offered, and there's mint growing behind the church. Perfect. We'll also need willow bark tea for the fever, and we should make a chest poultice to draw out the dampness. For the next several hours, Li Mei directed the women in creating remedies she had learned in China. They boiled water with eucalyptus leaves to create steam for Timothy to breathe, prepared willow bark tea to reduce his fever, and made a warm poultice of mustard seed and flour to place on his chest. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable. As Timothy breathed the medicated steam, his labored breathing began to ease. The willow bark tea brought down his fever, and the warm poultice helped break up the congestion in his chest. By evening, Timothy was sitting up and asking for water. His fever had broken, and his breathing was nearly normal. I don't understand how you knew what to do, Eleanor Johnson said, grasping Li Mei's hands. The other remedies weren't working, but yours did. Different places, same sicknesses, Li Mei replied simply. My people have been treating these problems for thousands of years. We just use different methods. Word of Timothy Johnson's recovery spread through Copper Creek like wildfire. Within days, Li Mei found herself being consulted about various health problems by people who had previously shunned her. She helped Mrs. Peterson with her painful arthritis using a liniment made from willow bark and mint. She showed the baker's wife how to treat her infant's persistent rash with a gentle wash made from oats and chamomile. Most significantly, she was asked to attend the birth of the blacksmith's baby when complications arose. The midwife, Mrs. Anderson, had been struggling with a difficult delivery when someone suggested fetching Li Mei. I don't usually work with outsiders, Mrs. Anderson said stiffly when Li Mei arrived. I understand, Li Mei replied respectfully, but if you would permit me to observe, I might be able to offer suggestions. The baby was in a breech position, and Mrs. Anderson had been unable to turn it safely. Li Mei watched the situation carefully, then spoke quietly. In my country, we use a technique for this problem. May I show you? With Mrs. Anderson's reluctant permission, Li Mei demonstrated a gentle massage technique that helped encourage the baby to turn naturally. Combined with specific positioning of the mother, the method worked, and within an hour, a healthy baby girl was born. Where did you learn that? Mrs. Anderson asked, her professional curiosity overcoming her prejudice. From my aunt, who learned from her mother, who learned from hers, Li Mei explained. The knowledge passes down through generations of women who help bring babies safely into the world. Mrs. Anderson nodded slowly, a new respect evident in her eyes. That was skillfully done. I'd like to learn more about your methods if you'd be willing to teach me. As autumn progressed into winter, Li Mei's reputation as a healer grew throughout the community. But her growing acceptance also stirred resentment among some residents who had been the most vocal in their opposition to her presence. Bart Hutchinson, who owned a small ranch north of town, had been particularly vocal in his criticism of James's choice of bride. He spent evenings in the saloon, complaining that Li Mei was changing the character of their community and that her foreign ways would corrupt their children. She's got these women believing in her heathen remedies, he grumbled to anyone who would listen. Next thing you know, she'll be teaching them to worship false gods and abandon their Christian faith. The situation came to a head during a terrible blizzard in late November. The storm struck suddenly, catching several children from the outlying ranches at the schoolhouse when it became too dangerous for them to travel home. Among the stranded children was Bart Hutchinson's 8-year-old daughter, Lucy, who suffered from weak lungs and had difficulty breathing in cold weather. As the storm raged and the temperature in the schoolhouse dropped despite the wood stove, Lucy began having serious trouble breathing. The schoolteacher, Miss Roberts, was at her wits' end when someone suggested sending for Lee May. But the storm was so severe that traveling even the short distance from the ranch to the school was extremely dangerous. James didn't hesitate when the message reached them. "I'm going," he announced, preparing to saddle his strongest horse. "Not alone," Lee May said firmly, wrapping herself in warm clothes. "If that child needs help, I should be there." "It's too dangerous for you to travel in this weather," James protested. "And too dangerous for that little girl to wait," Lee May replied. "We go together, or we don't go at all." The ride to the schoolhouse was treacherous, with wind-driven snow making it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. They followed the fence line, trusting their horses to find the way, and arrived at the school half-frozen but determined. Inside, they found Lucy Hutchinson struggling desperately to breathe, while the other children watched in frightened silence. Miss Roberts had done everything she could think of, but the child was clearly in serious distress. Lee May immediately went to work, having James help her create a steam tent using blankets and a pot of boiling water with medicinal herbs. She prepared a chest rub from ingredients in her traveling bag and showed Miss Roberts how to help Lucy breathe more easily by positioning her properly and supporting her back. Throughout the long night, as the storm raged outside, Lee May sat beside Lucy Hutchinson, monitoring her breathing and adjusting her treatments as needed. Gradually, the child's breathing eased, and she was able to rest more comfortably. When the storm finally passed the next morning, Bart Hutchinson was among the first parents to arrive at the schoolhouse. He burst through the door, wild with worry for his daughter, then stopped short when he saw Lee May sitting beside Lucy's makeshift bed. "Papa," Lucy called out weakly but clearly. "This lady helped me breathe better. She made the air warm and good for my lungs." Bart Hutchinson looked at his daughter, clearly improved and resting peacefully, then at Lee May, who sat quietly with her hands folded in her lap. The woman he had spent months vilifying had potentially saved his child's life. "Miss Lee," he said, his voice thick with emotion, I owe you an apology, and much more than that." Lee May stood and bowed slightly. "Your daughter is a brave girl, Mr. Hutchinson. I'm glad I could help her." "Why?" he asked, genuine confusion in his voice. "After the things I've said about you, why would you risk your life to help my child?" Lee May considered his question seriously. "In my country, we believe that all children belong to the entire community. When a child is in danger, we help because it's the right thing to do, not because of what their parents have said or done." Bart Hutchinson felt shame wash over him like a physical blow. This woman, whom he had called uncivilized and unworthy, had just demonstrated more Christian charity than he had shown in months. As word of Lee May's heroic actions during the blizzard spread throughout Copper Creek, the tide of opinion began to shift decisively in her favor. Even her harshest critics found it difficult to argue against the evidence of her character and her contributions to the community. Pastor Williams announced from the pulpit the following Sunday that Lee May would be baptized on Christmas Day. Having completed her religious instruction with remarkable dedication and understanding. "She has shown us all what it truly means to love thy neighbor as thyself," he declared to the congregation. Her actions speak louder than any words about the content of her character. Martha Henderson, who had been among Lee May's earliest critics, stood up in the church and publicly apologized for her previous behavior. "I was wrong about Miss Lee," she announced. "She has shown nothing but kindness and generosity to our community, and I'm ashamed of how I treated her when she first arrived." As December progressed, Preparations began for Lee May and James's wedding, scheduled for the day after her baptism. The ceremony would be the first wedding the community had attended where the bride was Chinese, and many people were curious about how the cultural differences would be handled. Lee May suggested incorporating elements from both cultures into the celebration, and the women of Copper Creek threw themselves into the planning with enthusiasm. They learned to make traditional Chinese dumplings while teaching Lee May their family recipes for wedding cake and other American traditions. James watched the transformation of his community with amazement. The woman he had written to as a practical solution to his loneliness had become the catalyst for bringing people together in ways he never could have imagined. But challenges remained. As news of the upcoming wedding spread to neighboring towns, some people expressed outrage that a Chinese woman would be married in a Christian church. Letters appeared in the regional newspaper questioning the wisdom of allowing foreign influences into established communities. Most concerning was word that a group of men from the territorial capital were planning to attend the wedding with the intention of disrupting it. They claimed that intermarriage between Americans and Chinese was contrary to both law and nature, and they intended to prevent what they called the corruption of white society. James received this news from the sheriff, who had gotten word from contacts in the capital. "I can't guarantee your safety if they decide to cause trouble," Sheriff Morrison warned. "These men have caused problems in other towns, and they don't care much about local law." Lee May listened to this conversation from the kitchen doorway, her heart heavy with the realization that their happiness might come at the cost of violence and division in the community that had finally begun to accept her. That evening, as she and James sat by the fire, she broached the subject that had been troubling her all day. "James, perhaps we should postpone the wedding," she said quietly. "I don't want our happiness to bring danger to the people who have been kind to us." James looked at her in surprise. "You want to postpone our wedding because some ignorant men from the capital might cause trouble?" "I want to protect the people who have accepted me," Lee May replied. "Mrs. Johnson, the Crawfords, even Mr. Hutchinson now. They've all taken risks to defend me. I can't ask them to face violence because of my presence." James took her hands in his, marveling once again at her selfless nature. "Lee May, if we let fear and hatred dictate our choices, then those men have already won. The people of this community have come to know and respect you. They won't be intimidated by outside troublemakers." As if to prove his point, there was a knock at the door. They opened it to find Bart Hutchinson standing on their porch, hat in hand, and looking unusually serious. "Evening, folks," he said. "I heard about the potential trouble for your wedding day." "Word travels fast," James observed. "It does indeed. That's why I'm here." Bart straightened his shoulders. "A group of us men have been talking, and we want you to know that we plan to be at that church on your wedding day. If anyone tries to disrupt the ceremony, they'll have to deal with us first." James felt a surge of emotion at this unexpected show of support. "Bart, that's generous of you, but I can't ask you to put yourself at risk for us." "You're not asking," Bart replied firmly. "We're offering. Miss Lee saved my daughter's life, and she's helped half the families in this town in one way or another. Anyone who wants to hurt her will have to go through the men of Copper Creek first." Behind Bart, they could see other figures in the darkness. Bill Crawford, Tom Bradley, and several other men from town, all nodding their agreement. Lee May felt tears spring to her eyes at this demonstration of loyalty and protection. These were men who had initially viewed her with suspicion and hostility, but who now considered her worthy of defending. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You honor me more than you know." As the men departed, Lee May and James stood on their porch looking up at the star-filled sky. The challenges ahead were real and potentially dangerous, but they were no longer facing them alone. "Are you ready for this?" James asked, putting his arm around her shoulders. Li Mei leaned into his warmth and strength, thinking of all they had overcome together and all that lay ahead. "I'm ready," she said firmly. "Whatever comes, we'll face it together." The wedding was now just weeks away, and Li Mei knew that the ceremony would be more than just the joining of two people in marriage. It would be a statement about the kind of community Copper Creek chose to be, one that judged people by their character rather than their origins, or one that gave in to fear and prejudice. The answer would come soon enough. Christmas Eve dawned crisp and clear in Copper Creek, with fresh snow sparkling like diamonds across the Montana landscape. Li Mei stood before the mirror in her small room, preparing for her baptism later that morning. The white dress that the women of the church had sewn for her was simple but beautiful, with delicate lace trim that Martha Henderson had contributed from her own wedding dress. Downstairs, the house bustled with activity as women from town arrived to help with the preparations. Eleanor Johnson brought fresh bread, Sarah Crawford contributed her famous apple preserves, and even stern Mrs. Anderson, the midwife, appeared with a carefully wrapped gift. "It's a tradition in our family," Mrs. Anderson explained, presenting Li Mei with a beautifully embroidered pillowcase. "Every new bride gets one made by the women of the community. You're part of our family now." Li Mei fingered the intricate stitching, recognizing the work of multiple hands. Each woman had contributed her own distinctive style to create something uniquely beautiful. "I will treasure this always," she said, her voice thick with emotion. The baptism ceremony took place in a church packed beyond capacity. People had come from neighboring ranches and even from the next town over to witness this historic event. Pastor Williams had chosen the location carefully, positioning Li Mei where everyone could see her clearly as she made her profession of faith. "Do you, Li Mei, accept Jesus Christ as your personal Savior and pledge to follow his teachings of love, compassion, and service to others?" Pastor Williams asked in his rich, resonant voice. "I do," Li Mei replied clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the church. "I have learned that Jesus taught the same truths my Father taught me, that we should treat others with kindness, help those in need, and live with honor. I gladly accept him into my heart." As Pastor Williams lowered her into the baptismal water, a profound silence fell over the congregation. When she emerged, water streaming from her dark hair, a spontaneous cheer erupted from the crowd. Even those who had initially opposed her presence found themselves moved by the sincerity of her commitment. After the ceremony, the entire community gathered at the church hall for a celebration feast. Li Mei had prepared traditional Chinese dumplings, teaching several women the intricate folding technique, while they shared their own family recipes with her. The result was a unique blend of cultures that delighted everyone present. James watched his soon-to-be wife move gracefully through the crowd, speaking with each person, remembering details about their children and their concerns. She had become the heart of this community in ways he was only beginning to understand. "You're a lucky man, James Mitchell," Sheriff Morrison said, joining him by the window. "That woman of yours has done more to bring this town together in 6 months than we managed in 6 years. "She's remarkable," James agreed. "Sometimes I wonder what I did to deserve her." "You opened your heart and your home to someone different," the sheriff replied. "That takes a special kind of courage." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Bill Crawford, looking grim and purposeful. He approached James with urgent news. "The men from the Capitol arrived this afternoon," he said quietly. "They're staying at the hotel, and they've been drinking and talking loud about disrupting the wedding tomorrow. There are about 8 of them, all armed and looking for trouble." James felt his jaw tighten. What do they plan to do? From what Tom Bradley overheard, they intend to storm the church during the ceremony and drag Li Mei away, claiming she's an illegal immigrant who has no right to marry an American citizen. "That's ridiculous," James said angrily. "Li Mei's papers are completely legal. She came here through proper channels. Truth doesn't seem to matter to these men, Bill replied. They're more interested in making a statement than following the law. James glanced across the room at Lee May, who was showing little Lucy Hutchinson how to fold paper into the shape of a crane. The child was giggling with delight at the magical transformation of plain paper into an elegant bird. "Have you told the others?" James asked. "We've got 12 good men ready to stand guard at the church tomorrow," Bill confirmed. "We won't let them ruin Lee May's wedding day." The news cast a shadow over the celebration, though most people remained unaware of the potential threat. Lee May noticed James's troubled expression and approached him with concern. "What's wrong?" she asked quietly. James hesitated, not wanting to spoil her joy, but Lee May's perceptive eyes missed nothing. "It's about tomorrow, isn't it?" she said. "The men Sheriff Morrison warned us about." "They're here," James confirmed, "but Bill and the others have a plan to handle them." Lee May was quiet for a long moment, watching the people around them enjoying the celebration. These were good people who had welcomed her into their community despite their initial fears and prejudices. The thought of them facing violence on her behalf was almost unbearable. "Perhaps we should cancel the wedding," she said softly. "I couldn't forgive myself if anyone was hurt because of me." James turned to face her fully, taking her hands in his. "Lee May, look around this room. Look at these people celebrating your baptism, sharing food you taught them to make, learning from your wisdom about healing and caring for children. You think they're here because they feel obligated?" Lee May studied the faces around them. Eleanor Johnson was attempting to fold dumplings under the patient instruction of Martha Henderson. Pastor Williams was deep in conversation with Mrs. Anderson about incorporating some of Lee May's herbal remedies into the church's ministry to the sick. Children played together while their parents shared stories and laughter. "They're here because you've enriched their lives," James continued. "You've made this community stronger and more caring than it was before you arrived. Tomorrow isn't just about our wedding, it's about choosing what kind of place Copper Creek wants to be." That evening, as Lee May prepared for what she hoped would be her last night as a single woman, she reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her to this moment. From her small village in China to this frontier community in Montana, she had traveled farther than distance alone could measure. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. She opened the door to find Martha Henderson standing in the hallway, holding a beautiful silk shawl. "This was my grandmother's," Martha said, offering the shawl to Lee May. "She wore it on her wedding day, and her mother before her. I'd be honored if you would wear it tomorrow." Lee May accepted the gift with reverence, understanding the significance of the gesture. "Mrs. Henderson, after the way I was treated when I first arrived, why are you being so kind to me now?" Martha sat on the edge of the bed, her expression thoughtful. "When you first came to town, I saw someone different from us, and I was afraid of what that difference might mean. But over these months, I've watched you care for our children when they were sick, help our women learn new skills, and face every challenge with grace and dignity." She paused, smoothing the silk of the shawl. "I realized that the differences between us, the color of your skin, the place where you were born, the language you first learned, those things don't matter nearly as much as the similarities. You love children, you care about helping people, you work hard, and you treat others with kindness. Those are the things that truly matter." Lee May felt tears welling in her eyes. "Thank you for giving me a chance to prove myself. Thank you for being patient with us while we learn to see clearly," Martha replied. "Sleep well, dear. Tomorrow is going to be a wonderful day." Wedding morning arrived with a brilliant sunrise that painted the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold. Lee May woke early, her heart fluttering with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. Today she would become Mrs. James Mitchell, but more importantly, she would officially join this community that had become her home. The women arrived at dawn to help her prepare, transforming the simple ranch house into a bridal suite. They dressed her hair with flowers from Mrs. Peterson's greenhouse, applied a touch of rouge to her cheeks, and helped her into the beautiful white dress that had been altered to fit her perfectly. The final touch was Martha Henderson's grandmother's shawl, which draped elegantly over Lee May's shoulders and caught the morning light like captured starlight. "You look beautiful," Eleanor Johnson declared, stepping back to admire their work. "James won't be able to take his eyes off you." As they prepared to leave for the church, Sheriff Morrison appeared at the door with an update on the situation downtown. "The troublemakers are awake and drinking again," he reported. "They're making a lot of noise about disrupting the ceremony, but our men are in position. We'll handle whatever they try." Lee May nodded gratefully, then surprised everyone by asking, "Sheriff, would it be possible for me to speak with these men before the ceremony begins?" The request caught everyone off guard. "Miss Lee, that's not a good idea," Sheriff Morrison protested. "These men aren't interested in reasonable conversation." "Perhaps not," Lee May agreed, "but I'd like to try." Sometimes understanding comes from unexpected places. James, who had been getting ready at Bill Crawford's house, was equally alarmed when he heard Lee May's request. "Absolutely not," he said firmly. "These men are dangerous, and I won't have you put yourself at risk." "James, I've been thinking about this all morning," Lee May explained. "These men are afraid of something they don't understand. Maybe if they could see that I'm just a person who wants to build a good life, like they do, it might change their minds." "And if it doesn't?" James asked. "Then we'll proceed as planned, but at least we'll know we tried to solve this peacefully." After much discussion, it was agreed that Lee May could speak with the men, but only with heavy protection from Sheriff Morrison and several armed townsmen. The meeting would take place on the steps of the church, where everyone could see what was happening. Word spread quickly through the community, and by the time the confrontation was scheduled, most of the town had gathered to watch. Lee May walked slowly up the church steps, flanked by James on one side and Sheriff Morrison on the other, with the men of Copper Creek forming a protective circle around them. The 8 men from the territorial capital stood in a loose group near the church gate, their leader a tall, hard-faced man named Wilson, who wore his prejudice like a badge of honor. "You the Chinese woman causing all this trouble?" Wilson called out, his voice carrying clearly in the cold morning air. "I am Lee May," she replied calmly, stepping forward slightly. "I understand you have concerns about my marriage to Mr. Cedar Mitchell." "Concerns?" Wilson laughed harshly. "We're here to prevent the corruption of decent American society. Your kind don't belong among civilized people." Lee May studied his face, seeing the certainty that came from never having his beliefs challenged. "Mr. Wilson, what is it about me that you find so threatening?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. He had expected defiance or fear, not genuine curiosity. "You're a foreigner," he said after a moment. "You practice heathen religions and follow alien customs. You'll pollute our bloodlines and corrupt our children." "I see," Lee May replied thoughtfully. "Tell me, Mr. Wilson, do you have children?" "I have 3 sons," he said proudly. "And when they are sick, what do you want most in the world?" Wilson looked confused by the question. "I want them to get better." "Of course." "So do I," Lee May said simply. "When little Timothy Johnson was dying of lung fever, I didn't think about his blood or his religion. I thought about a mother's tears and a child's suffering. When Lucy Hutchinson couldn't breathe during the blizzard, I didn't consider her nationality. I saw a frightened little girl who needed help." She gestured toward the crowd of townspeople watching the exchange. "These people have accepted me not because I'm Chinese or American, but because I've proven that I care about their families and their community. Isn't that what really matters?" Wilson shifted uncomfortably, aware that the crowd was listening intently to every word. Several of his men exchanged uncertain glances. You can speak pretty words, Wilson said, but with less conviction than before. That doesn't change what you are. You're right, Li Mei agreed. I am Chinese. I was born in a village 8,000 miles from here. I speak a different language and learned different customs as a child. But I'm also a woman who loves children, who wants to help sick people get better, who believes in working hard and treating others with kindness. She paused, looking directly into Wilson's eyes. Which of those things threatens you, Mr. Wilson? The fact that I look different, or the fact that I'm the same as you in all the ways that truly matter? For a long moment, the only sound was the wind whistling through the pine trees around the church. Wilson stared at this small woman who had just challenged everything he thought he believed about racial superiority and cultural purity. Furthermore, Li Mei continued, I notice you traveled a very long way to interfere with the wedding of two people you've never met, in a community where you don't live. Why is my happiness so important to you that you would spend your time and money trying to destroy it? One of Wilson's men shifted his weight and spoke up. Maybe we should just go, Wilson. This ain't really our business anyway. Wilson rounded on the man angrily. It's everyone's business when the natural order gets disrupted. What natural order? Asked Bart Hutchinson, stepping forward from the crowd. The order where good people help each other when there's trouble? Because that's the only order I've seen this woman support. She saved my son's life, Eleanor Johnson added, moving to stand beside Bart. What order would you prefer? One where children die because we're too prejudiced to accept help. More voices joined in from the crowd. Bill Crawford told about Li Mei helping with his wife and baby. Tom Bradley described how she had worked tirelessly during the blizzard. Mrs. Anderson spoke about the new medical techniques Li Mei had shared with her. Wilson found himself facing not just one Chinese woman, but an entire community united in her defense. The story he had told himself about rescuing decent people from corruption crumbled in the face of their obvious love and respect for Li Mei. You've all been fooled, he said desperately, but the conviction had gone out of his voice. Have we? Pastor Williams asked, stepping forward. I've spent months teaching this woman about Christian faith, and I can tell you she understands love and compassion better than many people who were born into the church. If she's fooling us, she's doing it by being kinder, more generous, and more selfless than most people I know. One by one, Wilson's men began to back away from the confrontation. They had come expecting to face a mob of troublemakers corrupting a decent community, but instead they found themselves opposing ordinary families, protecting someone who had earned their loyalty through her actions. This isn't over, Wilson said, but even he seemed to understand that it was. Yes, it is, Sheriff Morrison said firmly. You're going to take your men and leave this town peacefully, and you're not going to come back. If I see any of you in Copper Creek again, you'll spend the night in jail and face charges for disturbing the peace. As Wilson and his remaining supporters retreated toward their horses, Li Mei felt a profound sense of relief wash over her. The confrontation had ended without violence, and she could see in the faces around her that the community's bond had been strengthened rather than broken by the challenge. How did you know what to say? James asked as they watched the troublemakers ride out of town. I didn't, Li Mei admitted. I just spoke from my heart and hoped that somehow, underneath his anger and fear, Mr. Wilson had a heart that could hear. With the immediate threat resolved, the wedding ceremony could proceed as planned. The church was packed to overflowing, with people standing in the aisles and spilling out the doors. Li Mei walked down the aisle on Pastor Williams's arm, since she had no family to give her away, but she had never felt more surrounded by love and support. James stood at the altar in his best suit, his face radiant with joy as he watched his bride approach. When she reached his side and took his hand, he whispered, "You're the most beautiful and brave woman I've ever known." The ceremony itself was a blend of traditional Christian vows and cultural elements that honored both their heritages. Li Mei had requested that they include a tea ceremony to honor her ancestors, while James insisted on the traditional exchange of rings that symbolized their commitment in American culture. When Pastor Williams pronounced them husband and wife, the entire congregation erupted in celebration. Rice and flower petals filled the air as the new couple walked back down the aisle, their faces glowing with happiness. The reception that followed was unlike anything Copper Creek had ever seen. Tables groaned under the weight of food representing both cultures, traditional American fare alongside Chinese dishes that Li Mei had taught the women to prepare. Children ran through the crowd with paper cranes that Li Mei had shown them how to fold, while adults shared stories and laughter that bridged any remaining cultural gaps. As the evening progressed and the celebration moved from the church hall to the street itself, Li Mei found herself surrounded by well-wishers and friends. Mrs. Anderson presented her with a basket of medicinal herbs and asked her to continue teaching the women of the community about healing practices. Eleanor Johnson gave her a beautiful quilt made by the church ladies, with each square representing a different family's welcome to her. Most touching of all was the gift from little Lucy Hutchinson, a drawing of Li Mei helping her breathe during the blizzard, with "My Angel" written across the top in a child's careful handwriting. "You saved my little girl's life," Bart Hutchinson said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll never forget that, and I'll never forgive myself for how I treated you when you first arrived." "The past is done," Li Mei replied gently. "What matters is who we choose to be from this day forward." As the celebration continued late into the night, James and Li Mei finally found a quiet moment together on the church steps, looking out over the community that had become their home. "Do you ever regret leaving China?" James asked, his arm around his wife's shoulders. Li Mei considered the question, thinking of her family and the village she had left behind. The sadness of that separation would always be part of her, but it was balanced by the joy of the new life she had built. "I regret the pain of leaving my family," she said finally, "but I don't regret coming here. This place, these people, you. This is my home now." She looked up at the stars shining brilliantly in the clear Montana sky. "In my culture, we believe that everyone has a path they're meant to follow. Sometimes that path leads far from where you started, but if you follow it with an open heart, it will bring you to where you belong." James tightened his embrace, marveling at the wisdom and strength of the woman he had married. "And where do you belong, Mrs. Mitchell?" Li Mei smiled, the title still new and wonderful on her ears. "I belong here, with you, in this community that has become my family. I belong wherever love and acceptance can grow strong enough to overcome fear and prejudice." 6 months later, as spring returned to the Montana plains, Li Mei stood in the garden behind their house, teaching a group of ranch wives how to grow medicinal herbs. Her pregnancy was beginning to show, and she rested her hand on her growing belly as she explained the properties of different plants. The community had continued to flourish under her influence. The women had formed a cooperative to share knowledge about childcare, cooking, and healing. The men worked together more closely, sharing resources and supporting each other during difficult times. Children played together without regard for the cultural differences that had once seemed so important to their parents. Word of Copper Creek's harmonious community had spread to other towns, and delegations had come to learn how they had achieved such unity. Li Mei had become something of a local celebrity, though she remained as humble and hard-working as ever. "Mrs. Mitchell," called Sarah Crawford, approaching the garden with her 2-year-old son in tow. "Little David has that rash again. Could you look at it?" Li Mei examined the child with gentle hands, diagnosing the problem quickly and preparing a mild herbal wash that would provide relief. As she worked, she reflected on how much her life had changed since that first frightening day when she stepped off the train in Copper Creek. The woman who had once been scoffed at as a foreign bride had become the heart of the community, a healer, teacher, and friend whose influence had transformed not just her own life, but the lives of everyone around her. The towering rancher who had proclaimed her worth above all had been proven right in ways neither of them could have imagined. As the sun set over the Montana mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, Lee gathered her herbs and prepared to return to the house where James was waiting with dinner ready and stories of his day to share. Behind her, the women of Copper Creek continued their animated discussion of spring planting and summer plans, their voices carrying on the evening breeze like a song of home and belonging. Lee May Mitchell smiled as she walked toward her house, toward her husband, toward the life they had built together in this place where love had indeed proven stronger than fear, and where a small woman from across the world had found her true home at last.